Hi, welcome to our study of the muscular system and muscle physiology. So we will start with chapter 10, which is actually an introduction to muscles and muscle anatomy. And this is where we'll start, and then we'll end up with the physiology of muscles, especially skeletal muscle. When we think about the muscular system, it's kind of amazing to think that this system actually makes up half of the body's weight. So we understand that it's really important for overall health that the muscular system actually be maintained. There are more than 600 different human skeletal muscles. We think about this as being maybe a dead science because every muscle has been identified and labeled, but actually just recently a new muscle was discovered in the throat. So maybe it's not really a dead science. Maybe there's still more muscles to discover, depending on what type of dissections are actually being done. There may be really small, tiny muscles, but anyway, there are three different types that we learned about in histology. We learned that there's skeletal muscle, that's called that because it's attached to bone and it's involved in movement. There's cardiac muscle that is found in the heart. And then there's smooth muscle that is surrounding body organs and vessels that actually help to control organ volume. So we concentrate mostly in this section on the skeletal muscle, but we will also be bringing in some more facts about cardiac and smooth muscle. So myology is a term that you should be familiar with. This is the study of, ology means the study of the muscular system. And again, when we think about these functions, we know movement. We have movement because a muscle is attached to two bones, and as that muscle contracts, it means that we're going to be able to move from one place to another. Communication, speech, writing, facial expressions, and other non-verbal communications. Posture is important to prevent unwanted movements. And these are all functions of what we think the muscular system is doing for us. Again, controlling organ volume. Sphincters are these round muscular rings that actually help to move things within these vessels. If it's the GI tract, it means it's moving food. If it's in the blood vessels, it's moving blood. If the smooth muscle is in surrounding lymph vessels, it's moving lymph through our system. So very important function of that. Heat production is also something that's sometimes taken for granted. But we actually, if we start to feel cold, our muscles will contract, and it actually helps to produce as much as 85% of our body heat. So thermoregulation is absolutely a huge function of the muscular system. And also glycemic control. We remembered from early on in our studies in the first week, we talked about glucose homeostasis. We said that if once you eat a meal, the carbohydrates, some are used immediately, but some are converted to glycogen. Glycogen is a storage molecule of glucose that gets sent to muscles, which we're seeing here, and the liver. And between meals, you can actually take that glycogen molecule and break it down so that glucose molecules can be raised back up in the bloodstream and can be maintained for homeostasis. So glycemic control. When we think about the anatomy of a skeletal muscle, we already know some things. We know that we've learned already in our studies. We learned that tendons actually attach muscle to bone. We know that the bone that is going to be the stationary bone is called the bone of origin. The bone where the attachment occurs that is going to be moved is called the bone of insertion. And this tendon is connective tissue. If we look at this connective tissue, we see that it actually, we're going to see some other tissue types that are related to healthy muscle. Fascia is this connective tissue, and you can see it, we'll see it here. On a slide in a second. Here it is. So it's connective tissue that is actually really kind of encompassing the muscle fiber. We also know that we have epimysium that actually is on the outside of a muscle fiber. There's also perimysium and then endomysium that are sort of separating these muscle fibers and making sure that they are the blood vessels and the nerve supplies are being protected and supplying blood supply to the actual muscles. And so this is just some of the anatomy. I don't ever get you to label these, but this terminology is something that you should be a little bit familiar with. So mysium is going to be related to muscle, and then these prefixes, peri, epi, endo, these are all just prefixes that we see with a lot of different tissue types. So we should be a little bit familiar with those particular prefixes. Again, I'm not going to have you label any of these, just having you be familiar with the terms. So again, this fascia is that connective tissue that we said is separating these separating separate muscle fibers. There is something that's called a fasciitis, which is inflammation of the fascia. This can be very, actually it can be really life-threatening if someone has this. People call this flesh-eating disease. When people have this, it's typically caused from a bacterium, Streptococcus pyogenes, which is the same bacterium that causes strep throat. Again, it can be a life-threatening kind of event. But these are just some of the tissues that we associate with muscle fibers. So we know that organ systems are composed of 2 or more tissue types. So here you're seeing it's not just the muscle that is necessary for this organ system to function. It's not just these muscle fibers. There's connective tissue involved. There's nerve tissue involved. There's blood vessels involved and blood supply, which is also a connective tissue. So many different tissue types, the 4 different tissue types all coming together to compose the muscular organ system. Now, not all muscles are shaped alike, which should make sense because structure dictates function, and each of these different structures and shapes are going to have slightly different functions, and oftentimes the names of a muscle are actually being derived from their actual particular shape. So again, this is for your information. I am not going to ask you questions about this. This is just for your information about muscle shapes and types. So again, I did say that I wanted you to know that tendons connect muscle to bone. I had also said that it would be important for you to know that the origin means it's the bone that's stationary. The insertion is the bone that will be moving, that the skeletal muscle is attached to. And these are things that you would know if you were taking a class that was just on kinesiology, which is the study of movement. If we were taking class just in that, you would actually learn for every muscle that you learned, you would learn its bone origin. You would learn its bone of attachment, which is the insertion. You would learn what nerve innervates it, and you would learn what type of action it actually has. When we think about the actions, we know that the agonist, which is the prime mover, is the muscle that's producing the force that we will get on that particular joint. A synergistic muscle is one that is going to help the agonist, the prime mover. And then you have, for most movements, you're going to have an antagonist that opposes the prime mover. The reason that there's a muscle for each movement that you have antagonist is so that it prevents excessive movement, so that this is actually a very protective type of evolutionary development, so that you don't, with each movement, exaggerate the movement and cause injury. So this would be an important, this is an important action, just as important as the prime mover, the agonist. And then they're fixators. These are muscles that actually prevent movement of a bone. So those are really the 4 types of movement: prime mover, synergist, antagonist, and fixator. And you can just see an example of the muscles in the upper arm and how what they're actually doing. So the brachialis, you haven't learned the muscles yet, but the brachialis is just beneath, just inferior to the biceps brachii. I think most people know biceps brachii, but anyway, it's just beneath that. So that's the primary mover. Something that's helping it is the biceps brachii. An antagonist to that would be the triceps, and fixators are going to be the ones, that muscles that are holding the bone in place. So this just gives you an example. For each movement, there are going to be these types of muscles that have very particular actions. That is all just for your information. Most of this chapter is anatomy, and I'm going to show you a list in just a second of the muscles that you will be responsible for learning. Their basic anatomy. Of course, for skeletal muscles, there are more than 600 different ones, so you're going to see that your list is not nearly that number. It might seem like a lot when you first look at it, but we're going to, and it does take some time to learn these muscles, but you're going to learn some tricks on how to study for the anatomy of the muscular system. And it will take time, and so time needs to be devoted to it. But this chapter is dealing mostly with anatomy, and the next chapter is actually dealing with, chapter 11 is dealing with physiology. So let's continue on though, and look at some other terminology that we think about with the muscular system. Intrinsic muscles, intrinsic means within a certain region, so these are muscles that are going to all be found within a particular location, and so obviously their function is at that location. But there are also some extrinsic muscles that we know that are actually located in a distant area and having effects somewhere else. So like the fingers, for example, the extrinsic muscles in the forearm are actually playing a role in movement that you see with those fingers. Now again, innervation. For skeletal muscles that are under voluntary control, there must be a nerve that actually communicates with that muscle so that the muscle will react. So for each skeletal muscle, there is a known innervation nerve that will be communicating. It's under voluntary control. So that would be an important thing for you to know. We're going to talk about that in skeletal muscle physiology in the next chapter. But again, movement from skeletal muscles is under voluntary control, and it requires, before anything can happen with the muscle, it requires a healthy motor neuron sending in a signal to actually contract for movement. So when we think about these nerves, we know that there are spinal nerves that are coming off of the spinal cord that innervate anything below the neck, and there are cranial nerves that are going to innervate the neck and above the neck, so in the head. Certainly, you have to have constant blood supply to muscles or they will die. Just like any tissues, all cells that make up our tissues require a constant supply of nutrients like glucose and other nutrients, and especially oxygen. So blood, the red blood cells are bringing the oxygen to each of our cells, and particularly the muscle cells. And just again, for your information, not something I'm going to ask you a picky question about, but maybe it'll impress you to know that the muscular system is getting about 1.25 liters of blood per minute at rest. Per minute at rest. That's a lot of blood. If someone is involved in heavy exercise, you can see how this goes up by power of 10 or more, right? So there's this entire system requires a necessary, constant, consistent amount of blood supply. Now let's think about, we said this chapter is mostly anatomy, so it's mostly just learning where a muscle is and knowing its name. In our study of anatomy and physiology, all the organ systems, we don't have time for every muscle to learn every origin and every insertion and every nerve that innervates, but we do know that each muscle does have those particular structures that are helping them to carry out their functions. But we think about naming and how to study this. This is actually, it may at first look a little intimidating, but the names are Latin names. But if we know regions of the body, like we learned in Lab 2, body orientation and regions in descriptive terms, and if we learn the bones, which we should have by this time, all the names of the major bone groups, bones and bone groups and bone regions, then we also know about the joints and movements. If we use all of that information together that we have already learned and not forgotten, not memorized, but learned, then the names of these muscles really aren't as intimidating as you might think when you first look at the list. And I don't want you to be intimidated by it. As far as pronunciation of some of the muscles, you can actually go to your ebook site and you can actually listen to how to pronounce some of these muscles. But the names are always describing their structure, their location, or their action. And let's see if that's really true. This is a great slide. What slide number is this? I don't know. I can't see from the slide 22, I think it is, on your PowerPoint, because it gives you an anterior view and a posterior view of some of the more common muscles that we actually hear about and that we actually definitely do need to know. So when we are thinking about these names, let's see if some of the things I just gave you as far as hints on how they're named really holds true. You all learned that this bone here in the skull is called the frontal bone, and the muscle is the frontalis. You all learned that this bone in the back of the skull is the occipital bone. This muscle is the occipitalis, right? You all learned that this is the radius, this bone in the forearm that is here in the forearm is the radius, and you know that the region of the upper arm is the brachii. The upper arm region is brachii. So this muscle that is attaching here is called the brachioradialis. You all learned that this bone is the tibia, the shin bone is the tibia, and this major muscle that's in front of the tibia is called the tibialis anterior. So I really want you to pay attention to those names and pay attention to sometimes how the striations of the muscles are moving. Transverse, means that the striations are probably going straight across because you learned in regions of the body, and descriptive terms that transverse means across. Oblique means at an angle, so the striations would be running at an angle. These are just hints for you, okay, to actually, when you're looking at the names of these muscles, to try to associate them with either a bone, a region, or a movement, or a location. So that is why that's what's really important, that we've been building our knowledge as we've been going along, and that you really did learn the directional terms of the body. You learned bones, the names of bones, and then you learn joints and the movements associated with the joints. So this is actually a great slide to study because most of the major muscles are actually kind of on this in one slide in one go. But again, learning strategies, certainly you want to look at as many pictures as possible. When you look at the A&P, Anatomy and Physiology Revealed, which you all know where to go to. This is where you went to your body orientation. I hope that you actually looked at some of these other areas too that we've already done, including the skeletal system. This is a great tool. You can do little quizzes in here with each of these systems. You can do a little quiz. You can quiz yourself. But now we're on the muscular system. And again, a way to quiz yourself. Now, not all of the muscles listed in here will be ones that you will be required to know for the lab practical, but most of them are. You can find them. So, like the sternocleidomastoid. The sternocleidomastoid is a muscle that will be on your list, and it's here in this list. The temporalis, the temporal bone, right? This is the temporalis attached to the temporal bone. I'm seeing if there's any other ones here that's on your list. The trapezius is actually going to be on your list, and you can see it from this lateral aspect. It's not the best aspect. The best aspect would be a posterior view, and I could go up here and look at a posterior view. We could look at the posterior view, and we could look at that trapezius again. Much better view, right? So we can change all of these little, we can go to different regions, the thorax, the abdomen, the back, the shoulders, the legs, so we can look at different regions. And again, since time is limited for us and we're getting an overview of this, you would want to concentrate on the list that I give you and make sure that those are the ones that you're really concentrating on. Again, sometimes like from a different view, like a posterior view, you can certainly see the sternocleidomastoid, but it's not the best view to look at. Certainly a better view would even be an anterior view. And when we looked at the sternocleidomastoid, you can really see. The reason it's called that is that the mastoid region, which you all learned of the temporal bone, and the sternum here are the attachment sites for this particular muscle. So the mastoid region of that temporal bone, which I'm touching right here, I can feel, and that was one of the ways you want to learn, is by actually palpating even your own muscles. And then the sternal region down here. So again, the name really does tell you. It can tell you if you let that information help you. It can really sort of show you where you should be looking anyway. All right, let's see if I can get this back up with the, well, it doesn't want me to. I am going to close that out. So again, looking at cadavers, looking at models, looking at photos from your textbook. You have an atlas in your textbook and the ebook. Looking at that anatomy and physiology revealed, palpating your own muscles and saying them out loud to yourself is a great study tool. Now, the next slide is actually the word bank that I provide for you in your Canvas. So this is our word bank, and what I have done is taken the major muscles from each region. So the head and neck region, these are the major ones. The torso, these are the major ones you would want to know. Upper appendages and lower. These are the muscles that would be fair game for me to give you on a muscles lab practical, because you have them here. Take them one region at a time, study them all the ways we just discussed, and know one region well before you move to the next region. Use their names as far as their hints that they're giving you. Like we said, the occipitalis, the nasalis bone, the frontalis. Use their names to help you to learn them. Make it not so difficult. And then once you've learned one region, move to the next region. Okay? And until you've gotten all of these regions down. But this would be the word bank for the muscles that you need to study for the lab quiz. Now, much of the rest of this chapter is really just showing you lots of pictures of these bones. Again, I would maybe print out this so that you would know which ones that you are responsible for. Looking at them from different aspects, from anterior to lateral aspects, is going to be really important for you to do. So again, I'm going to go through this because most of this chapter is just pictures, and they are telling you some of their actions, but I'm not going to be asking that because we don't really have time too much for that, so I don't ask you any of that, but lots and lots of pictures. These abdominal muscles, the rectus means straight, so this is the one that you think about. Rectus abdominis are the muscles that we think about as the washboard effect that you can see on people who are very, very fit and thin enough. You can see the rectus abdominis. The abdominal muscles, once they are peeled back, it would hopefully make sense to you that the external means on the outside. External is more superficial than internal, just deep. And then the transverse is the one with the striations running straight across. The internal oblique is inside of the external, that is also oblique. So anyway, you can look at these different pictures, making sure that you are paying attention to whether something is superficial versus deep. Here is a great example of this. This is the platysma. This is a very superficial muscle here that I've got the mouse on. But if we went deep to that, if we actually remove the platysma, we would see that sternocleidomastoid. It's peeking out right here, but we'd have to go remove that to see that. Again, just lots of pictures. Use your book to make sure that you are, you use your list and use your pictures, use everything that you can just to try to study and make that study time valuable for you and working for you. As far as the muscles of the pelvic floor, I really don't have those on your list, mostly because it's just no way for me to really assess these for you all here. But these, again, all of these muscles would be important for you to just review over, just so you have an idea of, y'all have all heard of Kegel exercises. These are the exercises to strengthen the pelvic floor muscles. These are important for men and women. An actual pathology note to give you here is a term that you would want to know. You would want to know what a hernia is. It's actually any condition. Well, I need to do that. What did that just do? I don't even know what it did. Let's see if I can back it up. Really? A hernia is any condition where the organs actually push through the muscle protective layers, so they're protruding through weakened muscle points. So that's what a hernia is. Hernias are usually defined by where they're found. So an inguinal hernia, why do I keep doing that? And why does it do that? An inguinal hernia, let's see if I can get off of this, whatever this is doing. It won't let me. An inguinal hernia is actually one that's in the groin region. Men are more, this is more common in men because the men's anatomy, they have where their testicles descended from the pelvic region into the scrotal sac. They have an inguinal canal. So this inguinal canal has very important structures that are supplying nutrients and blood supply and nerve supply to the testicles. So in essence, it's kind of a weakened point, and sometimes the intestines can push through that area, and this is referred to as an inguinal hernia. A hiatal hernia is when the stomach, which is really just a muscular sac, pushes up through the diaphragm, that dome-shaped muscle that separates the thorax from the abdomen. The stomach pushes up through into the chest cavity. That's called a hiatal hernia. Umbilical hernias are at the belly button region. And then you can also have abdominal hernias as well in other places, but these are the more common regions that we associate with hernias. So again, the rest, lots of anatomy here. There's also compartment syndrome that we think about when there's been damage to a particular region. And again, muscles must have blood supply. They must have lymph return, fluid return from the tissues, and they must have nerve supply. So compartment syndrome is when there's been injury to a particular area, and it means that this blood supply can be obstructed. If there's ischemia, which means poor blood flow. I don't know why I don't know why this is doing this, but anyway, poor blood flow, then they can die. The tissues can start to die, and you can actually lose. Sometimes we would even have to require amputation if this ends up happening. So that has to be addressed right away. And sometimes what they're going to end up doing is actually making an incision just to relieve that compartment pressure there. So I'll just move along because, again, a lot of these are just anatomy pictures, just tons of pictures for you of graphics. Obviously this is graphics, but going to that cadaver would be a really good thing to do as well, just a different way to study it. The cadaver in your Anatomy and Physiology Revealed is a much more accurate view of the cadaver that you see in some of these pictures from your ebook, but all of them would be really, a way to study the names of some of these muscles. So you have your list, you saw it on that one slide, and you have this chapter that you can look at. I'm making sure that as I'm going through that I'm not forgetting another pathology thing. Here's another disorder that can happen. Carpal tunnel syndrome is a syndrome that actually occurs because of the entrapment of some of these accessory structures at the wrist area. The carpal bones are the wrist bones. So that's a very tight little space for a lot of very important structures coming through. And if that ends up becoming inflamed and swollen and whatever, we call this carpal tunnel syndrome. So sometimes they can just immobilize the area and rest it and treat with anti-inflammatories, but sometimes that's not enough, and that they will actually have to go in and release some of the tight ligaments that are holding this area, and can actually, they'll have to do surgery to do that. So that can be incredibly painful from what I understand. So that's another syndrome. I'm going to see if there's anything else I don't want to forget to mention to you. I'm going through these because if I don't mention it, you're not going to be responsible for it. For me, it doesn't mean you shouldn't really be looking at all these slides. You really should. They're great. These are great graphics and how to learn these muscles, especially learning muscles that are, whether they're superficial or whether they are really deep muscles. You will not see anything on your word bank about different heads, like long heads and short heads of these muscles. I've just grouped them for you. Just what's on your list. Okay, so just what's on your list, because any other, you really don't have time, since you only have a week or something to get these. You really don't have time for that. Again, you have a deeper insight within this chapter about some of the more common athletic injuries. Make sure that you look through that deeper insight. You know that you're responsible for those for the test, multiple choice questions on the test. So just take a look at that. We do think about some of these injuries as using RICE treatment. RICE meaning rest, ice, compression, and elevation. And these are some of the more common. These are what we would commonly do first for some of these more common injuries. So that is chapter 10, and really just mostly has to do with anatomy. There were a few disorders and diseases that we looked at, but this is mostly anatomy. You taking your list, taking all the resources that are available to you through your ebook, through your PowerPoint, through your Cadaver, Anatomy and Physiology Revealed, and taking that list and making sure that you are familiar with the muscles that are on that list. Okay, that's all for this particular introduction to the muscular system, and there will be another recording that has to do with muscle physiology, chapter 11. I'll see you then.